I want to be your head right now. You are the place, my only home.
The Tales franchise might not have the same level of JRPG seniority as Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, or Ys, but it's been around for its fair share of time. Since 1995, in fact, when Tales of Phantasia launched for the Super Famicom. Since then, the series has been slowly cultivating a larger and larger global presence with a steadily growing fanbase. The first title to truly achieve overseas popularity and acclaim was Tales of Symphonia, released for the Nintendo GameCube in 2004 for North America, which managed to grasp a must-have level of reception, with critics and players giving lots of praise towards its cel-shaded art style, snappy real-time combat, and steady 60 frames per second. Since then, many Tales games have been released on numerous platforms, with a few other noteworthy entries that garnered their own fair share of good reception. Tales of the Abyss for PlayStation 2, Tales of Vesperia for Xbox 360, which was my first Tales game, and was later remastered for the Xbox One, PS4, Switch, and PC, and the most recent Tales of Berseria for the PS4 and PC. After that, it was a particularly long wait to see what the future of the series would hold. Tales of Arise was finally revealed to the world at E3 2019, and with its announcement was the news that the series would no longer be on the usual in-house engine developed by Bandai Namco. It had now moved to Unreal Engine to allow for greater graphical quality that new hardware could achieve. The Arise development team is composed of both new members and Tales veterans, some of whom have been around since day one with Tales of Phantasia. With a migration to a different engine, a team of experienced developers, and the longest wait between main entries in the series, 5 years to be exact, Arise has a lot of promise. It seemed like it was shaping up to be the new best in the series. It came to light before this review went up that it succeeded in hitting 1 million copies shipped and sold digitally in less than 1 week, making it the fastest selling game in the franchise. So is it truly deserving of all this hype and success? Well, let's get down to the brass tacks and dive into the review. Tales of Arise takes place in the middle of a conflict between two races from two different planets in close proximity to one another. The Renans from planet Rena and the Danans from Dana, which is where most of the plot takes place. 300 years prior to the beginning of the story, the Renans staged an invasion and took over Dana, enslaving and ruling over the native population with an iron fist ever since. The position of lead protagonist for Arise is shared between two characters. Alphen, a Danid slave and amnesiac who can't feel pain and begins the journey with his face hidden behind an iron mask he can't remove, and Shion, a Renan woman who is cursed by the presence of thorns, a power that she can't control that causes people pain whenever they touch her. Together, Alphen and Shion team up to travel from region to region on Dana to liberate the enslaved Danans and defeat the powerful Renan lords that oppress them. Over the course of the adventure, they team up with other characters, as any JRPG would have you do, and also seek answers to many mysteries surrounding themselves and their people. And without getting into any spoiler territory, I will say that this game's scope gradually grows throughout its playtime, and eventually reaches a level I didn't expect when I first started. Crazy stuff happens in this narrative, and it does that thing where you finally get bombarded with all the answers you're looking for at once near the very end. The game strings you along with only a meager drip feed until, wham, it all comes out at the same time. I personally found it to be a worthwhile payoff, but some might grow impatient with the wait, only to end up perplexed when the huge info dump happens. Like any game in this genre, Tales of Arise's narrative, as complex or simple as it may be, is really only as strong as its main cast, and thankfully, all 6 are quite unique and quirky in their own right. We have the aforementioned mysterious and laser-focused Alphen and Shion, who have their own loves of weaponry and food. We have the young mage Rinwell, who enjoys Danan history and shares her journey with her little fluffball companion, Hootle the Owl. There's the young martial artist Law, whose entire personality is basically being addicted to physical training and putting his foot in his mouth. We have the stiffly formal and highly educated Dohalim and his former personal guard, Kisara, who is practically the mother of the group. Altogether, we're given a very colorful cast who have plenty of enjoyable exchanges throughout the game's playtime, and boy are there a lot of those exchanges. And they're supported by solid English voice acting, and oddly bogged down by typo-ridden subtitles that often don't match what the character is verbally saying. It's strange. Tales of Arise does not skimp out on either world building or character development and backstory, as this game takes every single opportunity imaginable to throw more and more dialogue at you. One of the staples of a Tales game is skits, which are short conversations among the party that pop up while you're exploring, and you can choose to view them later or right now. They range anywhere from plot-related discussions to providing insights to a certain character's past or interests, or to simple gags meant solely to amuse. If you're like me, you'll typically view them the moment they show instead of delaying them, and man oh man are there a ton. Sometimes you enter a new area and you'll end up watching 3, 4, or 5 of them in a row before you're all clear to continue forward. Generally speaking, Tales fans like skits. That includes me, because I'm very much used to them after playing several games. But if Arise is your first experience with this series, it might be a little bit annoying. Regardless, however, I do appreciate the team at Bandai Namco wanting to do as much as they can to give their protagonists as much time to shine as possible, and a lot of it is to help provide more context to the setting as well. And the setting is another point entirely, because Arise is a game that combines both high fantasy and space sci-fi aspects into one story. One moment we're on the surface of Dana fighting wolves with swords and magic, and then we see a cutscene featuring space opera-esque technology. And much to the game's credit, it's not a daunting transition. It still manages to feel pretty natural given the narrative. For those of you who are wondering, I did play the PlayStation 5 version, and the game is indeed very good looking. The move to Unreal Engine for the purpose of better visuals was not in vain. The art style is beautiful and manages to boast some great detail in character models and environments, especially areas with lush spots of foliage. Colors are really vibrant and manage to pop whenever they show up, and as Tales tradition dictates, the flashy combat effects absolutely flood the screen during the most intense battles, and performance almost never suffers for it. Arise does offer a choice between 2 graphical modes, as many games do this generation. One that prioritizes frame rate, and one that prioritizes resolution. Honestly, the difference is very minimal. Sure, you might find the occasional fuzzy edge on frame rate mode, but with a game that's so fast and throws so many particle effects at you, you're not really likely to care all that much. Thus, I recommend sticking to the frame rate mode, because it runs quite smoothly. In fact, I feel that if the game had a bit more time in the oven for optimization, the choice between the 2 modes wouldn't need to exist at all, which leads me into my one real complaint regarding the performance of the game. The PS5 version of Tales of Arise doesn't really feel like a PS5 game. I'm not gonna hold it against Bandai Namco, and I won't use this as a knock against the game itself, but it is worth mentioning for anyone who expected stellar utilization of the PS5 software. The haptic feedback is there, but really it's not so much haptic feedback as it is just general rumble. It doesn't seem to do anything all that special compared to the likes of Astro's Playroom or Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. Trigger resistance wasn't used at all as far as I could tell either. Loading times are decently fast, but by now I've already played much more graphically demanding games that load even faster. And like Tales games of the past, there's a very short draw distance for NPCs, who just spawn in plain as day in the middle of the screen, only a stone's throw away. So yeah, the PS5 version of the game might have that white banner at the top of the case, but when I actually play, it's obvious that it's still a game made and optimized mostly for PS4, and given only a paltry boost for its successor. I will say one thing though, to this game's benefit. Tales of Arise is the first game I've ever played that has an option that allows you to modify input queuing time. For those of you who don't know what that means, input queues are simply the game saving your button presses so it can commit the action once the previous one is finished. For example, a short input queue window is preferable and feels more natural, but a long one might be preferred by those who want to do actions in bursts. I've never seen this option before, and I really appreciate Bandai Namco for putting it in. Gameplay-wise, there's a lot to discuss, but before we dive into the combat, let's discuss non-combat aspects of the experience. First off, level design. I mentioned earlier that the game wastes no opportunities when it comes to throwing more lore at you, which is all fine and dandy. But this level of dedication and detail to the setting sadly doesn't translate over to direct interactivity, because this game is extremely linear. I'm not one to say that linearity is always inherently bad, and I'm not going to start here, but a significant portion of the game's locales are little more than hallways with minor deviations towards extra loot. There are things to pick up and treasures to find, but exploration is pretty on rails. There are a few spots that are larger and can provide an illusion of a much more expansive world, but it's not long until you're walking down a corridor again. They're beautiful corridors, but corridors nonetheless. In terms of side content, Arise is pretty basic. There's a coliseum where you can participate in fights for prizes. There are side quests that don't do much beyond asking you to collect items or kill monsters. There are Gigant monsters to hunt down like in past Tales games, and there's a few optional story-related dungeons and bosses for an extra challenge. Probably the most rewarding side content, however, is searching for owls scattered around the lands of Dana. Each one gives you a cosmetic accessory that you can put on any character, ranging from glasses and eye patches to dog tails and angel wings. As far as side content goes, Arise is pretty par for the course and meets the minimum of what you would expect from a JRPG. Similarly predictable is the path of gear and equipment for your party. Progression from one weapon or piece of armor to another is basically a 45-degree line to the upper right. You buy and equip the best that's available to you now, make progress, reach a new town, buy or find slightly better gear, and repeat. Accessories, on the other hand, are different and offer a multitude of buffs that you'll need at differing points in time. Thus, optimal play will have you switching out accessories for your whole party before every big fight. Furthermore, you get to craft those accessories yourself using materials of varying rarity, and the rarer the material, the stronger the accessory is, and the more perks it gives when you enhance it. Basically, progression in this game is linear in essentially every way, save for accessory crafting. However, that's not necessarily a major point against Tales of Arise, as many fans of the series are used to this by now. But another thing to Arise's credit is that there aren't nearly as many missables here as there were in previous games. In fact, I don't think there are any at all, but don't quote me on that. The point of no return is literally right before the final boss, so you can always go back and grab stuff that you might have accidentally skipped over. The thing that fans truly care about the most, however, is the combat. It's the part of the gameplay experience that always leaves a lasting impression, and more often than not, a person's favorite Tales game likely has their favorite combat system too. So how does Arise stand out among its predecessors? Does it do anything differently? And if so, does it feel good? Well, I'm pleased to say that it does indeed feel fantastic, but only on the player side. What do I mean by that? I'll explain. To keep things somewhat short, Tales of Arise has a system that does share a similar foundation with previous titles, particularly the ability to weave normal attacks with arts, which are special attacks that take up resources, in this case the art gauge. Physical attack arts, which is what Alphen uses, can range from multi-hit attacks that move him forward or backward to launchers that send the enemy up in the air or send Alphen himself up so he can transition to mid-air attack arts instead. By deftly switching from normal attacks to arts, you can maintain a combo and keep up the pressure. Combine that with the game itself discouraging you from spamming the same art over and over, it's balanced in a way that makes the game feel reasonably close to being a character action game. And like character action games, managing to achieve a lengthy, non-stop onslaught of attacks can feel very satisfying. It's an engaging system that I enjoy playing. I like controlling Alphen. You can control the other main characters too, but I basically stuck with him for the entire game. So what's the problem, you may be asking? Well, the problem is everything else. The player participation side of the combat is really good and investing, but the actual act of fighting enemies leaves a lot to be desired. Now don't misunderstand, there are still some great experiences to be had here, but man, I sometimes get really tired of fighting. To put it bluntly, battles can be exhausting sometimes, and for several reasons. Large enemies and bosses have very big health pools, which isn't an issue in itself, but it becomes one due to the fact that they're very resistant to being stunned. It makes my hits feel weightless and weak. In previous Tales games, it was possible to stunlock enemies from full health to death if you knew what you were doing. And it feels as though, in an effort to change this, the game flung itself towards the other extreme. The game does offer you resources and attack methods to momentarily stun big enemies and bosses at specific moments, yes, but those resources take a while to cool down, and the stun typically lasts only 2 or 3 seconds, which is rarely enough to do any meaningful damage due to their huge amount of HP. On the flip side of things, it's actually quite easy for your party members to be stunned or knocked out of attack animations. This becomes an issue when you're attempting to use lengthy attack arts or blazing sword attacks as Alphen, which have a charge-up time, because it seems that enemy AI will almost always prioritize targeting the character you're currently controlling. This interferes with the combo system that the developers made because it inadvertently encourages you to just stick with arts that come out the fastest so you can reliably build up the boost strike meter and finish the fight sooner. One of the first attack arts that Alphen learns in the game is called Swallow Blade, which is a quick 2-hit move, and I never, ever took it off. I had no reason to. I started the game with it equipped, and I ended the game with it equipped, because it was fast. Attempting to perform big arts with long animations just feels like a huge risk because you open yourself up to massive punishment every time you try it. And it's not worth doing that when you can essentially achieve the same result with a faster attack that doesn't force you to commit to a long animation. Basically, fights against big enemies and bosses just feel like I'm smacking a very tanky, spongy MMO raid boss for 10 straight minutes. Matter of fact, that's actually a really adequate comparison, because some of these bosses even have DPS checks and enrages where they spam one powerful AoE over and over again until either they kill your party or you finish them off. In past Tales games, player-side mechanics took precedence over enemy strategy, but this is reversed in Arise, and not in a great way. Now, more fights feel like they play the same because they all need you to stick to the same few key steps. Perform the right boost attack at the right moment to create a very small opening so you can actually hit more than 1 or 2 buttons without needing to stop and dodge. And then build up a boost strike so you can finally do meaningful damage. Repeat until the fight is over. It feels like those are the only actions that actually matter, and everything else is superfluous. And on top of all of that, the game has a pitiful amount of enemy variety. There's just 12 or so specific enemy archetypes with certain weaknesses, and then a dozen reskins of each of them that get stronger as you progress through the game. Many of the enemies you fight in the first several hours are essentially the exact same as many of the enemies you'll fight near the end, but with a palette swap. This makes the repetition in the combat that I just talked about even worse. And if you dislike fighting certain enemy types early on, chances are the game will never get better for you because you're going to be fighting those enemy types all the way through. And all of this is before I even mention these smaller annoyances like party members' mystic arts completely interrupting everything going on in the fight and refreshing the field. Doing things such as resetting enemy positions, resetting spells and removing status effects, and prematurely ending the enemy's already short stun state. Or the problem of some boss fights drowning out the screen with so many particle effects, it makes the task of avoiding damage even harder than it already is. Or the ethical issue of certain DLC costumes having arts or skills attached to them that improve the reliability or strength of certain characters by a significant amount, opening up viability for new strategies, like speeding up Rinwell's casting or turning Dohalim into a better healer. It really is remarkable how Tales of Arise has a combat system that's actually fun to participate in on the player's side, and then takes almost every step imaginable to suck the fun out of it and make it tedious. The developers laid a great foundation down for what could have been the best combat in the series, but then proceeded to build a rickety mess on top of it. That's not to say that there isn't even the faintest shred of enjoyability or anything. Some people will still be able to mesh with this combat perfectly fine, but I personally find it to be a major step down. If I wanted to play a game that felt like I was doing nothing but whacking spongy MMO raid bosses, then I would log into Final Fantasy XIV and do my dailies. This dissatisfactory combat is, without question, the game's Achilles heel, because combat is typically viewed as the most important attribute of Tales games. So if the battle experience feels uneven or weirdly contradictory in design like Arise does, then the entire game suffers for it. Overall, I would definitely still say that Tales of Arise is a solid game, as it does boast a beautiful art style, fantastic music, a well-rounded cast that receives more than enough time to shine, lots of world building and characterization, and a respectable but not necessarily outstanding amount of content. It's a decent place to start if you've never played a Tales game before, but depending on your receptiveness to the combat, particularly the poor enemy variety and seemingly misaligned mechanics between the player and enemy sides, your experience could be kneecapped in spite of how good it feels to actually control characters. I don't want to sound like some drama queen, but I kinda worry about the future of the series if the Tales team decides to stick with this exact same combat setup for future titles. I really hope they turn things around and make enemy mechanics as engaging and fun as player mechanics. This game had a lot of high expectations going for it leading up to release for multiple reasons, and for some, maybe even most players, it'll meet those expectations. But for me, Tales of Arise will be a prime example of how a game can be very disappointing while still being pretty good. This concludes my review of Tales of Arise. While I am very let down by the combat, I still enjoyed the game enough to be open to the possibility of playing it again, though admittedly, I don't expect to anytime soon. Considering the financial and critical success the game has already achieved, I'm cautiously optimistic about the future. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.